invitation. I'm looking forward to this conversation. I mentioned before other folks came on that I sent you a big draft of material that I'd been working on. I completed last summer. I basically wrote most of what I sent you last summer. And it's a rough draft, quite frankly. And it was kind of clear to me when I was reviewing it that it was very rough, but that's okay. So I'm going to be in this document that I sent you is a sort of condensed version. I went through, took out key passages, highlights, condensed it, and I'm going to talk through that. But at the end, you're free to ask me any questions about anything that you might have read in the draft that I sent you. But first of all, I want to start with this image right here. It's kind of an icon in the true sense for me, inspiring me on the work I do. And it's a marble relief and it's depicting what I understand to be this moment that is from the beginning of Plato's Phaedo. And the line, Socrates make music and work at it. And so what you see depicted here is Socrates with his muse or his dream figure who said to him, Socrates, make music and work at it. So this is really representing for me many things in the project that I'm working on. One, that Socrates obviously is a kind of philosophical educator, and that's important too. He's not just a philosopher, but his project is one of education. And secondly, that we might think of his work as a work of aesthetic education. And so it's based on that I'm sort of inspired, or from that I'm inspired to do the project that I'm working on. Currently, as I mentioned earlier, before we got going, I am focusing my own research and teaching on aesthetic education, or what I've been calling lately cultural education. And so, for example, in the course that I'm teaching now, we're exploring our cultural roots. That is to say, we are focusing on music, American folk roots music, so gospel, blues, jazz, and a lot of it has to, as well as poetry, a lot of it has to do with a certain situation that we have found ourselves in the United States in the last couple of years, to put it diplomatically, and the call that we've heard recently for unity. And so the argument is that I put forth in a set of courses that I'm teaching this semester is that there's already a common ground that we're moving along, and that common ground is supported by a network of cultural roots. That's how I describe it. And these cultural roots are expressed most intensely, or found, I should say, in the music, in our music. So we're doing a lot of or I've been applying and experimenting with a lot of the stuff that I'll be talking about in aesthetic education. But the sort of questions that I've been exploring with my students really do come out of an ancient tradition that is understood. There's some kind of relationship between philosophy and music, right? And so Plato in particular did a lot of work on that, and that's kind of what I want to focus on with you today. And so once again, going back to this image that it's on the screen right now, you recall that at the start of the Phaedo, Socrates confesses that he was surprised that his muse visited him again. He's in jail, he's awaiting his execution, and the muse shows up again. And when she does visit him, she says again, Socrates, make music and work at it. And he's really surprised by that. And he says, all along, I thought I was already doing that because philosophy is the most beautiful of music. But then he sort of paused. And what's interesting is he was by himself on his, without anyone around. And what was he to do? A dialogic philosopher by himself. And so what he decided to do was or he thought he should do rather, is to actually write music, which is to say compose songs. And he did that. He wrote some lyrics or some songs in honor of Apollo, his patron saint, so to speak. So for some time, as a result of that sort of thinking a lot about that line from the Phaedo, and Socrates' philosophical mission and his rethinking of his mission in the beginning of the Phaedo, I've been wondering about this very command, Socrates, make music and work at it, and what that might imply for philosophy. And how does it relate philosophy, or how does it take philosophy closer to the arts? Or perhaps philosophy is in some way in art. And specifically, what is this relationship between music and philosophy? And how does that relationship in some way carry out the Socratic tradition of philosophical education? And so I've been thinking a lot about that. And that's sort of the background for the work that I'm going to be sharing with you today. So I'm going to move over to my own screen. So I don't know what I will be looking like on your end, but I'm now moving forward. So Allison, if you want to go down to the next section, it's called Aesthetic Education and the Vita Contemplativa. So I took highlights of my writing that I shared with you from Aesthetic Education and the Vita Contemplativa, and I'm going to be reading from that section now. At the heart of my project on aesthetic education is the formative encounter that I'm describing as the turning, the experience with the work of art that captures our attention, captivates us, so much that we are virtually flooded over by the work of art, inundated by its creative power. In that aesthetic experience, we are attuned to the work, and our relationship is a contemplative one. We are engrossed in the work. As I read it, this is what Plato is getting at when he writes in the Republic. The entire soul must be turned away from the world of becoming until it is able to endure the sight of being and the most brilliant light of being. The thesis put to work in my project is that this most brilliant light of being is revealed through art in the aesthetic experience. My reading of Plato's allegory, which is mostly the focus that I'm going to be focusing on today is on the allegory of the cave, but also book 3 of the Republic. My reading of Plato's allegory of the cave is situated within an attempt to describe the process of a philosophical education happening via the aesthetic experience or encounter with art. And so one of the things I just want to point out is that oftentimes we talk about philosophy of education. That's usually the way we describe the field that most of us are in. But I've, for a while now, been talking about the philosophical education, which is a slight shift of the category of philosophy education. So that is to say that philosophy has a way of educating us. Right? And my focus is on aesthetic education as a kind of philosophical education. So an aesthetic philosophical education, just to put it as one category, emerges out of a phenomenological contemplation, which always involves a transcendental move beyond the self. This is what happens when we are engrossed, attuned to a work of art. Contemplation via the phenomenological attitude is perhaps the most intense way of attending to the matters that stand or appear before us. It might be described as the modality of being in harmony. And you can probably anticipate why that's important, because it's an aesthetic principle. Hence, the word attunement is used to name the modality of contemplation. Plato's student Aristotle described contemplation as the exercise of nous, an intuitive, immediate, and direct understanding of the eternal first principles. Contemplation is a pre-rational, instinctual, and thus primal state of awareness. Phenomenological contemplation plays a central role in Plato's allegory of the cave. The unshackled cave dweller is emancipated by philosophical contemplation. They learn their freedom through a process by which they are compelled to move up and out of the dark cave and into the light of day. This learning is a process of experiencing originality and authenticity. With each step, they are attuned to something that is more real. The process culminates in Plato with the perception of the sun, a metaphor for the primal originating force. If contemplation is best described as the state of proximity to the original and an attunement with the ideas, then Plato's allegory shows us, or allows us rather, to wonder how an encounter with art, the aesthetic experience, happens by way of phenomenological contemplation. Okay, if you could just go down to the next. And so there is just an image there from the allegory of the cave. and I think it's helpful. It's I don't actually believe that this is from a Attic vase or vase, but it's sort of in the spirit of that. So it's both intended to be a sort of Attic work of art, but it's also depicting not simply the allegory of the cave, but this engrossment with the object. So come back to that. All right, so if we go down to the next section called being turned. Plato's allegory is in fact a story about the artistry of philosophy. It's a story that shows how the educational process of turning, periagoge, is an art, the art of being turned around and positioned in the modality of phenomenological contemplation. Those little stars are notes to myself. In this sense, turning is an art in this sense of techne. And I wanted to point that out because when I say it's the art of being turned around and positioned in the modality of phenomenological contemplation, I want to emphasize the sense of art for the ancient Greeks is techne, which is to say then that it's a pedagogical technique or a way of teaching that has the goal or aim, that is to say the telos, to bring out a specific ideal or form in the world, such as the ideal of freedom. So thinking about art here in that Attic sense of techne and of bringing out an ideal form. And that's the sense in which I'm talking about the art of being turned around. The turning is an emancipatory event. Now, Heidegger has written an essay on Plato's allegory that's very important for my work, and a lot of the conversation that the work I'm doing in this presentation is in relationship to a conversation that I'm having with Heidegger, responding to things he says about the allegory. So Martin Heidegger asserts what the cave allegory is all about, therefore, is the liberation and awakening of the innermost power of the essence of man. Recall the Platonic premise that the human being already possesses a power, an innermost power for perceiving the truth, the original, and the authentic. So Plato says in the Republic that we already have within us this capacity to know the truth, and the challenge for us as educators is to turn people around so that they're able to realize this capacity that's already within them. I think he described it as it's not about putting sight in someone who cannot see, but rather turning someone around who can already see towards that which they should see. And I'm focusing on the turning around, the turning. So when read through aesthetics, this innermost power is revealed in the encounter with the plenitude that overflows from the work of art. The innermost power to receive and contemplate the world happens in the aesthetic experience with the attunement that connects us to the work's originality and singularity. In the Republic, Plato was working out the form and content of an education that will activate that innermost power by turning the learner around and positioning them in the place of phenomenological perception. The cave allegory is a story of education as the experience of being turned around and placed before what is true, real, beautiful, and good. In Plato's cave allegory, the turning mediates the encounter with authenticity. The authentic, authentikos, or genuine, stands in contrast to the inauthentic, the pseudo, which can deceive. The emancipatory turning described in the allegory shows how the liberated cave dweller gradually comes to the awareness that they have been living in a world of deception, a world made up of copies, a world of inauthenticity. And in the draft that I sent you, I talk about the difference between something that is an imitation and something that is a copy, and the distinction. The liberation from the cave is a turning around of the essence of the human, a leading out from a kind of darkened day towards the authentically unhidden. So that is important to cite because of its emphasis on authenticity. For Heidegger, the authentically unhidden is, quote, truth as aletheia, something that empowers our innermost essence to what it is, insofar as we comport ourselves to being as such. With Heidegger's reading, Plato's allegory depicts the emancipation of our innermost power, our capacity to be in the midst of things, such that we are capable of experiencing the full force or power of the authentic, the real. But this activation happens when we encounter truth as aletheia, the arrival or appearance of being or existence. But otherwise, our innermost power of perception is activated by an experience with the world, an experience with the full force of presencing. Rainer Schermann catalogs the ways that Heidegger describes aletheia as clearing, lightening, or alleviating, and as the free space of the open. Okay, so going down to the next section, Heidegger, paideia is not education or Bildung. So in his essay on the allegory of the cave, Heidegger makes this claim, and it's very emphatic. Paideia is not education, Bildung. So the Greek word paideia is usually translated as education, and of course, it will mean something when it's translated into English as opposed to German. And so Bildung, the translation of paideia into Bildung, has more to do with what I'm interested in, which is cultural education. But for Heidegger, what Plato was talking about is not that. It's not cultural education. And I disagree, but I'm going to explain to you why he says that and why I disagree. Heidegger calls us to think ontologically. So it's pre-cultural or ahistorically, you could argue at some level. To think the originary in its original and thus authentic sense. So to think being. But only an encounter with aletheia will yield that experience of thinking. So I hear this call to the aesthetic experience as a call to the aesthetic experience, to art, which is uniquely able to reveal the original. And there are moments in Heidegger where he says just that himself. But in this essay, he says that that's not, he doesn't read the allegory of the cave as pointing us in that direction. Heidegger wants us to experience an effacement, an unmediated experience with being, authenticity as such. Stripped down to an elemental force, being as the originary takes on the physicality of physis or nature or matter as the dynamic play of hiding and revealing, which is another characteristic of aletheia, that it's both presencing and absencing, hiding and revealing. In turn, for Heidegger, the paideia that is presented in Plato is not education in the sense of Bildung or cultural education, but actually more of a physical, existential education, the activation of a receptive phenomenological way of being, the releasing of our innermost power. This may be understood as a prelude to cultural education, but Heidegger is loath to grant that possibility, despite his numerous writings on the edifying power of poets and poetry. So there's a sense in which that effacement with being is exactly this preparation for an attunement with the work of art. But Heidegger doesn't concede that possibility or doesn't discuss that in this essay. Heidegger describes Plato's allegory as the gradual revelation of the essential as freedom. The empowering liberation described in Plato's allegory is for Heidegger an empowerment of the will, which manifests or comes into being most acutely through philosophical questioning. This turning is thus brought about by questioning. But Heidegger's reading does not accord with the arc of the allegory's narrative, which does not bend towards the free will, but on the contrary, depicts the emergence of the learner as the one who is subjected to the truth of unhiddenness, the truth of authenticity. The entire process, from the moment that the shackles are removed to the moment the cave dweller returns, is moved. This process is moved by compulsion, Plato's allegory is the original tale of compulsory education. The liberated cave dweller is compelled to turn around again and again, even when they have experienced the full force of agathon, the good, depicted by the sun. They are compelled to turn around again and return to the cave. In sum, Heidegger's nuanced reading cannot impose upon Plato's allegory the presence of the free will, neither Augustine's nor Nietzsche's. Indeed, using Heidegger's own language against him, and thus deploying one of his own critical techniques, the turning is a releasement of the will to knowledge, and the will to power. What is happening in the allegory is the formation of the phenomenological and contemplative thinker, the receptive person who, in Heidegger's language, performs Gelassenheit, the letting be of the world, the letting go of the will. So it's the inversion, I argue, of what Heidegger is saying. The innermost power that is activated is the power of Gelassenheit, or the power of letting be. The point here is that the emancipation depicted by Plato is paradoxically a liberation into an empowering form of tutelage, which means first to care for or protect, and secondly, to instruct or teach. This is a quieting of the will by the power of the encountered objects, the world. For Plato, philosophical questioning reorients us to the world such that we are compelled to think about it, but only after we have encountered it, experienced it. First and foremost, the learner is positioned into the place of receptivity or phenomenological contemplation. To borrow from Jean-Luc Nancy, the learner is a receiver, a listener, and not a philosophical subject. And finally, they are perhaps no subject at all, except as the place of residence. When the will is quieted, so too is the sound of subjectivity, or what Hannah Arendt calls the inner dialogue between me and myself. This quiet makes room for deep listening, for what Nancy calls the resonant subject who resounds with music. And Nancy is very important for the project that I'm working on. His book, Listening, and his section on listening to music is something that I've been doing a lot of work on. Okay, so going to the next section, Plato, the enemy of art. Okay. The reading of Plato's allegory of the cave is a tale of a philosophical education via the aesthetic experience. And that's challenged by Plato's infamous censoring of the poets, which is often mistakenly remembered as the purging of the artists from his utopian republic. So when people talk about Plato and they talk about the Republic and they talk about art, you often hear people say, oh, that's the book where Plato is banning the poets or banning the artist or something like this. And that language is nowhere in the Republic, so far as I understand it. But when we say that we want to read the allegory of the cave as a tale of aesthetic education, it nevertheless is troubled by the fact that Plato is critical of poets and painters and musicians, etc., which I'm going to get into now. So while it may appear ironic that he wrote in the dialogical form and that in his plays he often depicted fiction in the form of allegories, deployed fiction in the form of allegories in order to communicate his important philosophical insights, he was nevertheless consistent in his concerns about artists and the role they should play in his republic. He consistently doubted that artists, specifically performance artists, could offer a true account of their art. And so he doubted their ability to teach, which is the main concern. What are we going to teach and who is going to teach in this republic that we're building? This is very suspicious because, as you are probably know from reading lots of Plato, he doubted that artists could teach. Their talent was never in question, but their knowledge of their art was suspect, as he showed so devastatingly in his dialogue Ion. Perhaps because he was a literary artist, Plato had little patience for the performing arts. Whatever the case, there is for sure a paradox at the center of Plato with respect to poetry and the dramatic arts. As R.P. Sakowski puts it, Plato's dialogues are themselves examples of artistry that continue to be stage-worthy, and it is a paradox that Plato, the supreme enemy of art, is also the supreme artist. So you might guess I don't see him as the enemy of art at all. The allegory of the cave is a succinct response to the question concerning the education of the guardians of the Republic. How might we educate in such a way that the learner is formed into a citizen leader whose one and only care is the cultivation of freedom? Plato spends ample time on the early part of that education because he recognizes the sensitivity and vulnerability of humans, especially at a young age. As we know, and we know very well in the United States recently, people are always susceptible to having their emotions stirred up and put out of balance. The challenge is to educate in such a way that builds up a harmonious soul. That's for Plato. The Republic as a body politic is ideally a harmonious gathering of citizens. Justice and freedom are expressions of that harmony. In turn, as he describes it in Book 3 of the Republic, the education of the Republican citizen, especially at the early stages, will include only that which is an expression of simple harmony and well-balanced or steady rhythm. There's no question that justice and freedom in the Republic must ultimately be viewed through an aesthetic prism, as realizations of the good and the beautiful. In turn, Plato's education of the Republican citizen is primarily an aesthetic education. Early education is organized through the principles of art, which is to say, the criticism and censoring of artists, specifically poets, is not an arbitrary show of force by the philosopher Plato. On the contrary, his critique, censoring or purging, emerges from the recognition that true, real, or authentic artists understand the formative power of their work. In other words, they can explain what they're doing and they can teach it as a result. This is why Plato describes the work of the Republic's guardians as a craft, which is to say, the art of governing or statecraft. Those who are responsible for the administration of the Republic must be true artists. The art of governing is, in fact, a performance art, and that is why Plato spends most of Book 3 on style or form, on the proper mimetic attitude, the position or proper position of performance that must be learned by those being educated to care for and cultivate the Republic. The education of the guardians must ensure that they are intensely and single-mindedly focused on the matter at hand, because they are servants of the people. This is why the phenomenological contemplative attitude is so crucial. They must be capable of caring for others, of attending to the needs of the people, and having the people as their first and foremost concern, not themselves. They must be prepared, quote, in reading from Plato, to dedicate themselves wholly to the maintenance of freedom in the Republic, making this their craft, and engaging in no work which does not bear on this end. They ought not practice or imitate anything else. If they imitate at all, they should imitate from youth upward only those characters which are suitable to their work: the courageous, temperate, holy, free, and the like. It's from Book 3 of the Republic. An encounter with art from a young age builds up that power of attention and reception, and it also places them in close proximity to the beautiful, the harmonious, and rhythmic. As Plato works through his critique of artists with the main focus on poets, the most influential and formative artists at his time, during his time, he begins by highlighting the need to edit the content of poetry. From a young age, students will be formed by the arts, and the formation must always have the aforementioned outcome in mind, the formation of a harmonious soul. Again, Plato's philosophical education is a craft, techne, and that is why Socrates was urged on by his dream figure, his muse, to, quote, make music and work at it. The educator is an artist, crafting the beautiful, harmonious soul. So this educator must be first and foremost a curator and an editor, one who can rightly select the art that will be most formative. Rather than being an enemy of the arts, Plato insisted on what he believes to be thoughtful curating of the arts in the early stages when students are being introduced to art, and more importantly, to the principles of harmony, rhythm, and virtues such as courage. In fact, not hostility, but humility guides his curation. He recognizes that his education is in large part a cultural one, which is to say, an education in the tradition that is conveyed through the arts. In Book 3, Socrates says, "And we must beg Homer and the other poets not to be angry if we strike out specific passages, not because they are unpoetical or unattractive to the popular ear, but rather because the greater the poetical charm of them, the less they are meant for the ears of those who are meant to be free and who should fear slavery more than death." Okay. And there's something left hanging in that quotation that hopefully we'll come back to, which definitely problematizes one of the key theses in the heart of my project. This idea that something that is too powerful will make us, a work of art that's too powerful renders us unfree. So maybe we'll get a chance to explore that. Okay, this is the final section, becoming musical. After working through the matter of content, what is in Homer, etc., Plato takes up his second line of critique, which focuses on form and style, and in doing so pivots back to his essential claim regarding the turning of the soul and the subsequent position of the person in that proper place, which is the close proximity to the authentic or the original. The original in this case are the principles of harmony and rhythm. The ideal of beauty is reflected in those works of art that are organized by those principles. Art is the imitation of the ideas. Plato's aesthetics discovers the ideal of beauty in harmony and rhythm because he is already guided by the complementary principle of singularity. The work of art is an expression of wholeness, the harmony of being, its integrity. It is the emergence of singularity that is key, and the link between freedom and beauty cannot be overlooked nor understated. The free soul, what Nietzsche will call free spirit, is the beautiful soul. Paradoxically, the beautiful soul is free because it is emancipated into an encounter with the idea of beauty. For Plato, freedom is relational, the connection or harmony between the soul and the ideas. In this sense, the turning is a returning by way of memory, the soul's recollection or recollection, a remembering as a gathering again of its former pure spiritual state. In some sense, the formation of the beautiful soul is a reformation, and thus the turning around of the soul towards contemplation of the truth can be described as a returning of the soul towards contemplation of itself as a beautiful, free being, as part of a harmonious cosmos. This may be what Nancy is getting at when he describes the resonant subject who resounds with music. Contemplation is thus a moment that recalls a higher state of being. And this higher state of being is recognized, recalled, remembered in the aesthetic experience, which is to say, with the encounter with the work of art that places the soul in a direct encounter with the idea of beauty. It is the originality, which is to say the singularity of the original, that is imitated or reflected in the work of art. The artist renders originality, but also displays excellence. Hence, Plato emphasizes that the education via art will only reform the beautiful soul when it is focused on a singularity, and thereby teaches us how to maintain singular focus or to be singular. Human nature, he writes in Book 3, seems to be incapable of imitating many things well. In other words, the paideia of the beautiful soul must take a minimalist aesthetic approach where less is more minor est plus. The minimalist aesthetic reflects the simplicity of ideal forms whose power resides in the uncomplicated singularity, their extraordinary uniqueness. Thus, when the moment arrives to select the harmonic and rhythmic style best suited to the formation of the beautiful soul, Plato insists they will be chosen for their simplicity, and that means, quote, within the limits of a single harmony, and in the like manner, we will make use of nearly the same rhythm. Plato describes the paideia of the philosopher and the formation of the beautiful soul as becoming musical. What can we gather from book 3 is the necessity, what we can gather from book 3 is the necessity of the free person being musical. And this entails a listening to what is truly and essentially musical. What might that be? Becoming musical happens in relation to those harmonies and rhythms that are best suited to form the beautiful free soul. It follows that the curatorial and editorial work of the teacher demands an aesthetic understanding, the capacity to think aesthetically. In other words, the knowledge of the essential that would form or educate a musical being is an artistic undertaking, an understanding, or an understanding of an artist, one who can make music and is working at it. An aesthetic educator performs a kind of teaching that entails making music, which existentially is an expression of the beautiful goodness of freedom, the beauty of freedom, a performative demonstration of the free spirit. To know is to show in the sense of performance, being free, emancipated into singularity, which is the defining characteristic of the artist as well as the philosopher. But doesn't this reduction sweep away the work of art as an object imbued with the power of singularity and the idea of beauty? Is teaching now understood to be a performance art? If being musical is an expression of being free, then it is only ever expressed in the understanding we gather from an encounter with what is truly and essentially musical. And this is precisely why the formation of the beautiful free soul via the aesthetic experience happens through reflection, contemplation of the forms. For Plato, to contemplate the forms is to hear the truly and essentially musical, to hear the harmony and rhythm they are making in the works of art that express them. Plato writes that when selecting the formative harmonies and rhythms, we ought not seek out complex systems of meter, but rather to discover what rhythms are expressions of the courageous and harmonious life. And when we have found them, we shall adapt the foot and melody to the words like spirit, not the words to the foot and melody. This is precisely why the essential forms that are formative of the beautiful free soul are those that are encountered in the melodies and rhythms that are, in a sense, free, or expressions of freedom, which is to say autonomy in the Attic Greek. Once becoming musical has been understood as resonance or resounding of the essential, then the challenge is to identify those rhythms and harmonies that are expressing the truly and authentic expressions of freedom. This is what an aesthetic education requires. And that is what I have for you all for now.
Great, thank you very much. That was very, very rich and very thought-provoking.